The heat of the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Jane Goodwin stared at the smoldering remains of what had once been her home. Tears streaked through the soot on her face, her hands trembling as she clutched her 6-year-old son Thomas to her side. 3 days had passed since the fire had devoured everything they owned, leaving nothing but charred timber and ash in its devastating wake. The year was 1875, and life in the small town of Esperanza, Texas, just 20 miles from El Paso, had never seemed more hopeless. "Mama, where are we going to sleep?" Thomas asked, his small voice cutting through Jane's despair. "I don't know, darling," she whispered, unable to tear her eyes away from the ruins of the modest ranch house her late husband had built with his own hands just 5 years earlier. "I truly don't know." Jane had lost Henry 2 winters ago to pneumonia. Left alone with their son and the small cattle ranch, she had managed to keep things afloat through sheer determination and grit. But this seemed insurmountable. The fire had started in the barn during a lightning storm, spreading with terrifying speed until it engulfed the main house. She and Thomas had escaped with nothing but the clothes on their backs and her wedding ring. They had been staying with the widow Peterson, a kindly neighbor who lived a mile down the dusty road, but Jane knew they couldn't impose forever. The insurance money, if it ever came, would be months away. The cattle had scattered during the fire, and rounding them up alone would be impossible. "Mrs. Goodwin," the deep voice startled her. Jane turned to find a tall figure silhouetted against the harsh sunlight. As he stepped closer, she recognized him as the cowboy who'd recently started working at the Thornton Ranch. She'd seen him in town a few times, nodding politely from across the general store. He was a new arrival to Esperanza, mysterious and rarely speaking to anyone unless necessary. "Mr. Reed, isn't it?" she asked, straightening her posture despite her exhaustion. "Yes, madam." "Robert Reed," he confirmed, removing his hat. His dark hair was damp with sweat, his tanned face serious beneath several days' worth of stubble. "I heard about what happened. Whole town's talking." Jane looked away, embarrassment mingling with her grief. "Yes, well, these things happen out here, I suppose." Robert shifted his weight, his spurs jingling softly. "I brought some tools," he said simply, gesturing to his horse where several canvas bags hung from the saddle. "And I've got a wagon coming with lumber and supplies." Jane stared at him, uncomprehending. I don't understand." His blue eyes met hers directly. "We rebuild, Mrs. Goodwin. That's what folks do out here." "I can't afford to hire help," she said quickly, pride stiffening her spine despite the defeat that had been crushing her moments before. "The bank won't loan to a widow with no collateral, and I'm not asking for payment," Robert interrupted gently. "Just figured you and your boy need a roof over your heads before winter comes." Thomas peered out from behind Jane's skirts, studying the tall stranger with curious eyes. "Can you really fix our house, mister?" Robert's weathered face softened as he looked at the boy. "We sure can try, son." "Why?" Jane asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. In the harsh realities of frontier life, charity rarely came without expectation. "You hardly know me, Mr. Reed." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes traveling over the devastation before them. "Lost my own family to fire when I was not much older than your boy," he finally said, his voice low. "Nobody helped us rebuild. Had to watch my mother struggle for years after." He looked back at Jane, his expression unreadable. Figured things could be different this time. Before Jane could respond, the sound of wagon wheels grinding against the dirt road caught their attention. A team of horses pulled a heavily laden wagon into view, driven by a burly man Jane recognized as the owner of the lumber mill. "That's my cue to get started," Robert said, settling his hat back on his head. Unless you'd rather I didn't. Jane looked at her son's hopeful face, then back at the ruins of their home, and finally at the enigmatic cowboy standing before her with an offer too generous to comprehend. Pride warred with necessity in her chest. "We accept your help, Mr. Reed," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the approaching wagon. "And we're grateful." Robert nodded once, his expression remaining serious. "Then we better get to work, Mrs. Goodwin. Daylight's wasting." With those simple words, Jane felt something she hadn't experienced in days, a flicker of hope, small but persistent, like a stubborn flame refusing to be extinguished. The wagon pulled up, and 3 more men jumped down, ranch hands Jane recognized from neighboring properties. They nodded respectfully to her before beginning to unload lumber, nails, and other building materials. "Thomas, why don't you run over to Mrs. Peterson's and tell her we'll be staying a bit longer," Jane said, smoothing down her son's hair. "Then come straight back." As Thomas scampered off, Jane turned back to find Robert already surveying the foundation of her home, measuring the dimensions with confident strides. "It's not charity, Mrs. Goodwin," he said without looking up, as if reading her thoughts. "It's neighborly. You'd do the same if roles were reversed." Jane watched as the men began clearing away debris, their movements efficient and purposeful. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this was simply the way of things in the West, harshness balanced by unexpected kindness, destruction followed by rebuilding. For the first time since the fire, Jane allowed herself to believe that all might not be lost after all. The following days passed in a blur of activity. Jane rose before dawn each morning, preparing a hearty breakfast for the workers at Mrs. Peterson's kitchen before heading to the homestead. Robert was always there ahead of her, already working in the cool morning air, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms bronzed by the Texas sun. By the end of the first week, the foundation had been repaired, and the frame of the new house stood proudly against the vast blue sky. It was smaller than her previous home but sturdier, with thicker walls to withstand the harsh winter winds and proper fire breaks built into the design. "It's not what you had before," Robert apologized as they paused for water during the heat of midday. "But it'll keep you and your boy warm and dry." Jane shook her head, overcome with emotion. "It's more than I dared hope for, Mr. Reed." He nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Jane had noticed how he rarely spoke unless necessary, preferring to let his actions convey his intentions. The other men respected him despite his newcomer status. She'd seen it in the way they deferred to his judgment and followed his lead without question. "Why did you come to Esperanza?" she asked suddenly. "It's hardly on the way to anywhere." Robert took a long drink from the water ladle before answering. "Was riding through on my way to California. Stopped for supplies, then saw the Thornton place was hiring." He shrugged. "Seemed as good a place as any to winter over." And before that, a shadow passed over his features. "Drove cattle up from San Antonio. Before that, fought in the war. Before that." He trailed off. "Does it matter, Mrs. Goodwin?" "Jane," she corrected softly. "If you're rebuilding my home, you might as well use my given name." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Jane, then." Their eyes met briefly before he looked away, setting down the water ladle and returning to work without another word. As the second week progressed, Jane found herself watching Robert more often than she cared to admit. There was something compelling about his quiet competence, the careful way he handled tools, the patience he showed when teaching Thomas simple carpentry skills. Her son had taken to following the tall cowboy like a shadow, asking endless questions that Robert answered with surprising thoroughness. "Your boy has a good head on his shoulders," Robert remarked one evening as they stood surveying the day's progress. The roof was nearly complete, and the walls had been erected and reinforced. "He's like his father that way," Jane replied, a familiar ache squeezing her heart at the mention of Henry. "Always curious, always wanting to understand how things work." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "Lost my pa young too, makes a boy grow up fast." "Too fast sometimes," Jane agreed, watching as Thomas carefully hammered a nail under the supervision of one of the ranch hands. "I worry he's missing out on being a child." "Some lessons are worth learning early," Robert said, "like how to rebuild after losing everything." Jane glanced at him, sensing deeper meaning in his words. "You never told me what happened to your family. After the fire, I mean." Robert was quiet for so long that Jane thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant for her ears alone. "Ma took in washing, worked herself to illness. My sister and I did what we could, odd jobs, hunting for food. I was 15 when Ma passed. Sister married a storekeeper in Dallas year after." He paused. "I've been on my own since." "I'm sorry," Jane whispered, fighting the urge to reach out and touch his arm. He shrugged, his eyes still on the horizon. "It was a long time ago." "Is that why you move around so much? Because there's nothing to tie you down?" The question seemed to surprise him. He considered it before answering. "Never found a reason compelling enough to stay anywhere, I suppose." Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas running up, proudly displaying a small wooden box he'd made with help from the other men. Jane exclaimed over it appropriately, but her mind remained on Robert's words, wondering what kind of reason might be compelling enough to make a man like him put down roots. As the third week began, unexpected rain delayed construction, turning the work site into a muddy mess. Robert arrived at Mrs. Peterson's door early one morning, his hat dripping and his expression apologetic. "Can't work in this," he said simply, "but I figured your boy might like these." He handed Jane a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were wooden farm animals, a horse, cow, and sheep, each whittled with surprising detail. "Did you make these?" Jane asked, running her finger along the smooth curve of the wooden horse. Robert nodded, looking almost embarrassed. "Had time last night, not much else to do when it rains." "Thomas will love them," she said, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Won't you come in for coffee? Mrs. Peterson is visiting her daughter in El Paso for the day." Hesitation flickered across his face before he nodded, removing his hat and wiping his boots thoroughly before stepping inside. The small house felt even smaller with his tall frame filling the kitchen. Jane busied herself with the coffee pot, suddenly nervous in a way she hadn't been since her courting days with Henry. "Smells good," Robert commented as she poured the strong brew into 2 chipped cups. "It's nothing fancy," Jane apologized, "but it's hot." They sat at the small table, the rain drumming steadily on the roof above. The unusual quiet without Thomas's chatter or the sounds of construction created an intimacy that made Jane acutely aware of the man sitting across from her. "Tell me about before," Robert said suddenly. "Before the fire." Jane cradled her cup, warming her hands. "We were managing. Not thriving, perhaps, but getting by. Henry left us with a small herd, about 30 head. I sold off a few each year when money got tight." She sighed. "The ranch was never going to make us rich, but it was ours. And now. She paused, considering. "Most of the cattle scattered during the fire. I've spotted a few with our brand grazing on neighboring land, but rounding them up alone would be impossible." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "We could organize a small roundup when the house is finished. Get your stock back together. Folks around here seem willing to help. I could ask around." Jane studied him over the rim of her cup. "Why are you doing all this, Robert? The truth this time." He met her gaze steadily. "Told you, I know what it's like to lose everything." There's more to it than that. He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly between his hands. Maybe I'm tired of drifting. Maybe helping you rebuild feels like, I don't know, building something of my own in a way. The honesty in his voice made something flutter in Jane's chest. Before she could respond, the door burst open and Thomas rushed in, soaked to the skin and grinning widely. "Mama, Mr. Reed, come see. One of our cows came back and she has a calf." Robert raised an eyebrow at Jane, a smile tugging at his lips. "Seems like things might be looking up, Mrs. Goodwin." As they followed Thomas out into the rain to see the returning livestock, Jane couldn't help but feel he might be right. The rain continued for 2 days, but when the skies finally cleared, work resumed with renewed vigor. Word of Jane's situation had spread throughout the county, and more volunteers appeared, bringing additional supplies and food. What had begun as one man's compassionate gesture had transformed into a community effort. By the end of the 4th week, the new house was nearly complete, a sturdy 2-room cabin with a stone fireplace and a small covered porch. It wasn't grand, but to Jane, it represented something profound, the possibility of starting over. "We should be able to finish the interior work tomorrow," Robert told her as they stood on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Thomas was helping the other men pack up tools for the day, his small face serious as he carefully placed each item in its proper place. "I can hardly believe it," Jane said, emotion thickening her voice. "A month ago I thought all was lost." Robert glanced at her, his expression softening. "You're stronger than you know, Jane. You would have found a way with or without help." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but I'm grateful I didn't have to." The sunset cast a golden glow over Robert's features, softening the angles of his face and highlighting flecks of amber in his blue eyes. Jane found herself wondering what it would be like to reach out and touch the stubble on his jaw, to feel the texture of it beneath her fingertips. The thought startled her, and she looked away quickly, her cheeks warming. It had been 2 years since Henry's death, 2 years of focusing solely on survival and raising Thomas. She hadn't allowed herself to think of any man in such a way since becoming a widow. "Will you stay?" she asked abruptly. "In Esperanza, I mean." Robert seemed caught off guard by the question. "Haven't decided yet," he replied after a pause. "Thornton's offered me steady work through spring after that." He shrugged. "You'd be welcome to visit. Thomas would miss you terribly if you disappeared." "Just Thomas?" he asked, his voice low. Jane met his gaze, her heart quickening. "No," she admitted softly. "Not just Thomas." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Then Thomas called out, breaking the spell, and they both stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they had been standing. "Better help the boy," Robert said, clearing his throat. "See you tomorrow, Jane." She nodded, watching as he walked away, wondering if she had imagined the lingering warmth in his eyes. The following day brought the final push to complete the house. By mid-afternoon, the last of the interior walls had been plastered and the wooden floors laid down. Simple furniture donated by various neighbors or crafted on site was arranged inside. A table with 4 chairs, a sturdy bed frame for Jane, a smaller one for Thomas, and basic kitchen implements. "It's perfect," Jane whispered as she stood in the center of the main room, turning slowly to take it all in. Robert watched her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "It'll do for now. You can make improvements as you go along." "We should celebrate," one of the ranch hands suggested. Housewarming party. The idea caught on immediately. Someone was dispatched to town for supplies, and by early evening a proper celebration was underway. Neighbors brought food and drink. A fiddle player appeared from somewhere, and lanterns were hung from the porch rafters, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Jane found herself swept up in the festivities, accepting congratulations and heartfelt good wishes from people she'd known for years, but never truly appreciated until now. Thomas ran about with the other children, his laughter a sound she realized she hadn't heard nearly enough in recent months. Through it all, she was acutely aware of Robert's presence. He stayed on the periphery, accepting thanks with awkward nods but clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. Several times, Jane caught him looking her way, his gaze quickly shifting when she noticed. As the evening wore on and the celebration showed no signs of winding down, Jane slipped away, needing a moment of quiet. She walked to the newly constructed corral where the handful of recovered cattle, including the cow and her new calf, were contentedly munching hay. Needed some air. She turned to find Robert approaching, 2 tin cups in his hands. He offered one to her and she accepted it gratefully, taking a small sip of the whiskey inside. "It's overwhelming," she admitted. "All these people, their kindness." "Community's important out here," he said, leaning against the corral fence beside her. "Folks need each other to survive. And yet you've managed on your own all this time." He took a sip from his cup, considering. Surviving isn't the same as living, Jane. The simple statement carried the weight of personal experience. Jane studied his profile in the moonlight, seeing beyond the stoic exterior to the solitary soul beneath. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. "When there's no more house to build?" "Thought I might help round up the rest of your cattle," he replied. "Should be able to track down most of them if we put in the effort." And after that, he turned to face her fully. "What are you asking, Jane?" She took a breath, gathering her courage. "I'm asking if you might consider staying, not just in Esperanza, but here with us." Surprise flickered across his features, quickly replaced by uncertainty. "I'm not sure I'd make much of a rancher." "You've shown aptitude for building things," she countered, her heart pounding. "And Thomas adores you." "And what about his mother?" Robert asked softly. Jane met his gaze steadily. "His mother is beginning to think there might be room in her heart for more than memories." Robert set down his cup on the fence post, then gently took hers and placed it alongside his. His calloused hands came up to frame her face, his touch hesitant, as if she might pull away. "I didn't come here looking for this," he murmured. "Neither did I," she whispered. "But here we are nonetheless." When his lips met hers, Jane closed her eyes, surrendering to the tenderness of the moment. His kiss was gentle, questioning, allowing her the chance to retreat if she wished. Instead, she leaned into him, her hands finding purchase on the solid warmth of his chest. The sound of approaching footsteps caused them to part quickly, both flushed and slightly breathless. One of the ranch hands appeared, oblivious to what he had interrupted. "Mrs. Goodwin, they're asking for you back at the house. Something about cutting a ribbon on your new door." "I'll be right there," Jane replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. As the man walked away, Robert took her hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. "We should talk more tomorrow." She nodded, reluctant to break the connection between them. "Tomorrow." They rejoined the party separately, but throughout the remainder of the evening, Jane was conscious of Robert's gaze following her. And each time their eyes met across the crowded room, the same unspoken question hung between them, a question about possibilities and futures neither had dared consider until now. The morning after the celebration dawned clear and cool, the first hint of autumn crispness in the air. Jane awoke in her new home, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings before memories of the previous evening came flooding back. Thomas still slept soundly in his small bed, exhausted from the excitement. Jane moved quietly through the house, marveling at the solidness of it, the care that had gone into every joint and beam. Her fingers trailed along the smooth wooden table where Robert had sat for hours, carefully planing the surface to remove any splinters that might catch on small hands or delicate fabrics. A soft knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Robert standing on the porch, hat in his hands, looking as uncertain as she'd ever seen him. "Morning," he said, his voice gruff. "Hope it's not too early." "Not at all," she replied, stepping aside to let him enter. "Coffee?" He nodded, and they moved to the small kitchen area in companionable silence. Jane busied herself with the stove while Robert stood awkwardly, clearly wrestling with what to say. "About last night," he began finally. "Yes," Jane prompted when he didn't continue. "I don't want you to think. That is, I didn't help you rebuild expecting anything in return." Jane turned to face him. "I know that, Robert," he nodded, relieved. "Good, because what happened between us, do you regret it?" she interrupted, suddenly afraid of his answer. "No," he said immediately. "No, I don't. But I need you to understand who I am, Jane. I've been drifting since I was 16 years old. Never stayed anywhere longer than a season or two. Never had reason to." Jane poured the coffee into 2 cups, considering her words carefully. "People can change, Robert, when they have reason enough. You and Thomas deserve better than a saddle tramp with no prospects. That's not how I see you." His expression softened. "How do you see me then?" Jane set down the coffee pot and looked him straight in the eye. "I see a man who dropped everything to help a woman and child he barely knew. A man who works harder than anyone I've ever met. A man who carved toys for a boy who lost everything." She took a step closer to him. "I see a good man, Robert Reed, one worth getting to know better." He swallowed visibly. "You hardly know me." "Then give me the chance to learn," she challenged. "Stay. Not forever if you don't want to, but long enough to see if what's between us is worth exploring." Before he could respond, Thomas appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His face lit up when he saw Robert. "Mr. Reed, did you come to have breakfast with us?" Robert looked from the boy to Jane, something shifting in his expression. "If your ma doesn't mind." "I insist," Jane said, her heart lightening at the way Robert's shoulders relaxed slightly. It wasn't a commitment, but it was a beginning. Over the next few weeks, a routine began to establish itself. Robert continued to work at the Thornton Ranch during the day but spent most evenings at Jane's homestead, helping with repairs, teaching Thomas about horses, or simply sitting on the porch talking with Jane after the boy was asleep. True to his word, he organized a small cattle roundup, bringing together several neighboring ranchers to help recover Jane's scattered herd. By the end of September, they had located 23 head bearing the Goodwin brand, not the full count, but enough to give Jane a solid foundation for rebuilding her livelihood. As autumn deepened, bringing cooler temperatures and golden light to the Texas landscape, Jane found herself falling into an easy companionship with Robert that increasingly felt like something more. He remained reserved in many ways, rarely speaking of his past beyond the sparse details he'd already shared, but his actions revealed the character of the man more eloquently than words ever could. He built shelves inside the house when he noticed Jane had nowhere to store her few books. He fashioned a small desk for Thomas when the boy mentioned wanting a place to practice his letters. He repaired fences, reinforced the barn, and helped Jane plan for winter, all without being asked. And sometimes, when Thomas was occupied elsewhere, Robert would kiss her gentle kisses that gradually became more confident as he grew assured of his welcome. Yet for all the progress in their relationship, Jane sensed Robert's deep-rooted hesitation about committing to staying permanently. He spoke of spring roundups and cattle drives with a faraway look in his eyes that made her heart constrict with uncertainty. The situation came to a head in early November. Jane had invited Robert for Sunday dinner, planning to serve the special apple pie Thomas had been anticipating all week. But when the appointed hour arrived, Robert was nowhere to be seen. "Maybe he got held up at Thornton's," Jane told Thomas, trying to hide her disappointment. "Can we wait a little longer before eating, Mama, please?" Jane agreed, but as the sun began to set with still no sign of Robert, she reluctantly served dinner for just the two of them. Thomas picked at his food, his earlier excitement dampened. "He promised to show me how to throw a lasso today," the boy said quietly. "I'm sure he had his reasons for not coming," Jane replied, though doubt gnawed at her. "We'll save him some pie." After putting Thomas to bed, Jane sat alone on the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. The vast Texas sky stretched above her, stars appearing one by one in the deepening twilight. She tried to suppress the fear that Robert had finally given in to his wandering instinct and moved on without saying goodbye. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance pulled her from her thoughts. A rider approached slowly, and even in the dim light, Jane recognized Robert's silhouette. Relief washed over her, quickly followed by indignation at the worry he had caused. He dismounted, leading his horse to the hitching post before climbing the porch steps. His expression was somber, his movements stiff. "You missed dinner," Jane said, not bothering to keep the hurt from her voice. "Thomas waited as long as he could. I know, I'm sorry." Robert removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Got held up in town. For hours." He sighed, taking a seat beside her on the porch bench. "Got a telegram from my sister in Dallas." Jane's irritation faded, replaced by concern. "Is she all right?" "She's fine," he assured her. "But she wrote that there's work available. Good work with the railroad, station manager position." He paused. "In Dallas." The words hung in the air between them, their implications clear. Jane's heart sank. "I see," she said finally. "When do you leave?" Robert looked at her sharply. "I didn't say I was taking it, but you're considering it." It wasn't a question. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point. "It's steady work, Jane, better money than cowboying, security I've never had. All in Dallas," she couldn't help adding. "Yes." Jane stood abruptly, needing to put some distance between them. "You should take it then." "If that's what you want." "Jane," he reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "No, Robert, I understand, truly." She fought to keep her voice steady. "You warned me from the beginning that you weren't one to settle down. I was foolish to hope otherwise." "That's not fair," he said, rising to his feet. "I've been here nearly 3 months. I've helped rebuild your home, round up your cattle, and I'm grateful," Jane interrupted. "But let's be honest with each other. You've had one foot out the door the entire time." Always careful not to make promises, not to commit. His jaw tightened. "I've been honest about who I am." "Yes, you have," Jane acknowledged, tears threatening despite her best efforts. "And now you have an opportunity that makes sense for a man like you. You should take it." Robert stared at her for a long moment, hurt and frustration evident in his eyes. "If that's what you think is best." "What I think doesn't matter," Jane said softly. "It's your decision to make." He put his hat back on, his movements deliberate. "I'll say goodbye to Thomas tomorrow." "That would be kind," Jane managed, though the thought of her son's inevitable heartbreak made her own pain sharper. Robert nodded stiffly and descended the porch steps, untying his horse with quick, efficient motions. Jane watched him mount up, her throat tight with words she couldn't bring herself to say. As he rode away, disappearing into the darkness, Jane finally allowed her tears to fall freely. Morning brought a crisp clarity to the air, and a hollowness to Jane's chest that no amount of deep breathing seemed to fill. She went through the motions of preparing breakfast, responding to Thomas's chatter with appropriate noises while her mind circled endlessly around the previous night's conversation. She had just set plates on the table when a knock sounded at the door. Thomas bounded over to answer it, his excited voice carrying across the room. "Mr. Reed, Mama said you were coming to say goodbye. Are you really leaving?" Jane steeled herself before turning around. Robert stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking as though he hadn't slept any better than she had. His eyes met hers briefly before returning to Thomas. "Actually, son, I wanted to talk to you and your ma about something important." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Mind if I join you for breakfast?" "We have plenty," Jane said, her tone carefully neutral as she set another plate on the table. They sat down to eat, the tension between the adults going unnoticed by Thomas, who immediately launched into a story about a lizard he'd found the day before. Robert listened with apparent interest, asking questions and nodding at appropriate intervals, though Jane caught him glancing her way several times. Finally, as Thomas finished his eggs, Robert cleared his throat. "Thomas, I need to talk to you and your mother about something serious." Man to man, all right. The boy straightened in his chair, clearly pleased to be addressed in such a grown-up manner. "All right, Mr. Reed." Robert took a deep breath. "You know I got a job offer in Dallas. It's a good position, working for the railroad." Thomas's face fell. "So you are leaving?" "Well, that's what I wanted to discuss." Robert looked directly at Jane now. "The job comes with housing, a proper house with 3 bedrooms near the station." Jane frowned, not understanding where he was going with this. Robert continued, his voice steady but his hands betraying his nervousness as they fidgeted with his coffee cup. "I spent all night thinking about it, about what I want, what would make sense." He paused, "and I realized something important." "What's that?" Jane asked quietly. "That for the first time in my life, leaving somewhere feels wrong." His eyes held hers. "The job's a good opportunity, yes, but it's not worth leaving behind what I've found here." Hope flickered in Jane's chest, but she tamped it down, afraid to misunderstand. "And what have you found here, Robert?" "A purpose," he said simply. "People who matter to me. A chance at something I never thought I'd have." He glanced at Thomas, then back to Jane. "A family, if you'll have me." Thomas looked between them, confusion evident on his young face. "Does that mean you're staying, Mr. Reed?" Robert smiled slightly. "That depends on your mother, son." Jane's heart hammered in her chest. "Robert, are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you, Jane Goodwin," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "You and Thomas both. And if you'll have me, I'd like to stay. Not just for now, but for good." Thomas's eyes widened. "Like as my new pa," Robert looked at the boy solemnly. "If that's something you'd want someday, and if your mother agrees." "Mama," Thomas turned to Jane, excitement building in his voice. "Can Mr. Reed stay forever? Please?" Jane stared at Robert, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "What about the job, the security?" "I spoke with Thornton this morning," he replied. "He's offering me a position as foreman starting next month when his current man retires." He leaned forward. "It's not as much money as the railroad, but it's steady work close to home." He paused. "Close to you." "And you're certain?" Jane pressed, needing to be sure. "This isn't just because you feel obligated." Robert reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Jane, I've spent my whole adult life running from place to place, never letting myself get attached. Then I stopped here and found something worth staying for." His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "I love you. I think I have since the day I saw you standing in front of your burned home, refusing to be defeated." Tears welled in Jane's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I was so afraid to admit it, even to myself." "So he can stay?" Thomas asked eagerly. "Forever." Jane laughed through her tears, squeezing Robert's hand. "Yes, Thomas, if that's what he truly wants." "It is," Robert affirmed, his smile transforming his usually serious face. "More than anything." Thomas let out a whoop of delight and launched himself from his chair. throwing his arms around Robert's neck. The man caught him easily, his expression a mix of surprise and profound emotion as he returned the boy's enthusiastic embrace. Jane watched them, her heart so full it felt close to bursting. From the ashes of devastation, something beautiful had grown a second chance, a new beginning, a family forged not by blood but by choice and love. Later that evening, after Thomas had been put to bed, Jane and Robert sat together on the porch swing, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "I've been thinking," Robert said, his arm warm around her waist. "A dangerous pastime," Jane teased. He chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her ear. "I'm serious. I've been thinking about us, about the future." Jane tilted her head to look up at him. "And what conclusions have you reached, Mr. Reed?" "That I don't want to waste any more time," he said, his expression growing solemn. "I've spent too many years drifting, Jane. Now that I know where I belong, I don't want to wait." "Wait for what?" Robert shifted, turning to face her fully. From his pocket, he withdrew a small object that glinted in the lantern light, a simple gold ring, unadorned but beautifully crafted. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice soft. "The only thing I kept after she passed." Jane's breath caught. "Robert, I know it's fast," he said quickly. "Too fast, maybe. And if you need time, I understand, but I want you to know my intentions." He held the ring between them, a tangible symbol of his commitment. "Jane Goodwin, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to Jane's eyes for the second time that day. "Yes," she whispered without hesitation. "Yes, I will." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit almost perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "Thomas will be overjoyed," Jane said as Robert gathered her into his arms. "We'll tell him together in the morning," he murmured against her hair. "As a family." The words settled around them, warm and right. As Robert's lips found hers in a tender kiss, Jane marveled at how completely her life had transformed in just a few short months. From the darkest moment of despair to this perfect happiness, all because a kind stranger had appeared with tools and the simple, powerful promise: "We rebuild." The wedding took place on a clear December morning, with the distant mountains outlined crisp and blue against the horizon. The entire community of Esperanza turned out for the occasion, filling the small church to capacity and spilling onto the steps outside. After all, this marriage represented more than the union of two people. It was the culmination of a story that had touched everyone who had participated in rebuilding Jane's home, and by extension, her life. Jane wore a dress of pale blue, borrowed from the mayor's wife and altered to fit her slender frame. Thomas stood proudly beside Robert at the altar, the boy's face solemn with the importance of his role as best man. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas was the first to cheer, his young voice rising above the applause that filled the church. The celebration afterward was held at the Thornton Ranch, with tables set up in the barn cleared especially for the occasion. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a golden glow over the gathering as fiddles played and boots stomped in time to lively tunes. "Mrs. Reed," Robert murmured in Jane's ear as they moved together in a slow dance, "has a nice ring to it." Jane smiled up at him, still marveling at the new weight of his mother's ring on her finger. "It does indeed, Mr. Reed." "Are you happy?" he asked, his expression suddenly serious. "Truly, happier than I ever thought possible," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to brush her lips against his. "Are you having second thoughts about settling down, Cowboy?" His arm tightened around her waist. "Not a one. Best decision I ever made." Across the room, Thomas was attempting to teach some complicated hand game to the other children, his laughter carrying over the music. Jane watched him, her heart swelling with love. "He's blossomed these past months," she observed. "Having you in his life has made all the difference." "He's a fine boy," Robert said, his gaze following hers. "You've done a remarkable job raising him on your own." "We're not alone anymore," Jane reminded him. "Either of us." As the evening progressed and the celebration showed no signs of winding down, Robert led Jane outside for a moment of quiet. The December air was crisp but not unbearably cold, the night sky ablaze with stars. "I have something to show you," he said, taking her hand and guiding her toward a wagon hitched nearby. "What is it?" Robert helped her up onto the seat before climbing in beside her and taking the reins. "A surprise. For both of us, really." He clicked to the horses, and they set off down the road, leaving the sounds of the celebration behind. Jane nestled against his side, content to wait as they traveled through the darkness. After about 15 minutes, Robert turned the wagon onto a small side trail that Jane didn't recognize. When he finally drew the horses to a halt, they were in front of a modest cabin set back from the road, its windows dark but its outline visible in the moonlight. "Whose place is this?" Jane asked, confused. "Ours," Robert replied, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "If you like it." Jane stared at him. "I don't understand. I've been working on it in my spare time," he explained, helping her down from the wagon. "Thornton sold me the parcel, 50 acres, including good grazing land and access to the creek." He led her toward the cabin. "It's not finished inside yet, but I wanted to surprise you." As they approached, Jane could see that the cabin was larger than it had first appeared, solidly built with a stone chimney and a wide covered porch similar to the one Robert had built for her after the fire. "But what about our home?" "The ranch?" she asked, still processing this unexpected development. "We can keep both," Robert said. "Use the original homestead for the ranch operations, live here where we'll have more space." He watched her face anxiously. "That is, if you like it. If not, we can stay where we are." Jane walked up the porch steps, running her hand along the sturdy railing. "You built this yourself?" "Had some help from the same men who helped rebuild your place," he admitted. "But yes, mostly by myself. Been working on it evenings and weekends for the past month." Jane turned to him, overcome with emotion. "No one has ever done anything like this for me before." "Get used to it," he said softly, drawing her into his arms. "I plan to spend the rest of my life building things for you and Thomas." As Jane leaned into his embrace, the reality of their new life together settled around her like a warm blanket. From the devastating fire that had nearly broken her spirit to this moment of profound happiness, the journey had been remarkable. "I love you, Robert Reed," she whispered against his chest. "And I can't wait to make this house our home." His lips found hers in the moonlight, sealing their new beginning with a kiss filled with promise. Spring arrived in Esperanza with a riot of wildflowers and the sweet scent of new growth. The Reeds had settled into their new home, filling it with furniture crafted by Robert's hands and small touches that made the space uniquely theirs. Thomas had his own room for the first time, with a window overlooking the creek where he spent hours fishing when his chores were done. The ranch was flourishing under their combined efforts. Robert had proven to be as skilled with cattle as he was with carpentry, implementing new breeding practices learned during his years of traveling that improved the quality of their herd. Jane handled the business side of things, negotiating favorable contracts with buyers and managing their growing finances with shrewd acumen. On a warm April morning, Jane stood at the kitchen window, watching as Robert and Thomas worked together in the corral, breaking a young horse for riding. Her hand rested on her still flat stomach, a secret smile playing at her lips as she contemplated the news she would share with them that evening. Another child to love, another reed to add to their family, proof of new beginnings and second chances. As she watched her husband patiently demonstrating proper technique to her son, Jane reflected on how completely her life had transformed in less than a year. From the ashes of devastation, they had rebuilt not just a home but a future together. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Jane finally shared her news. Robert's expression of stunned joy was quickly followed by an embrace so tender it brought tears to her eyes. Thomas, upon learning he would be a big brother, ran excited circles around the yard before bombarding them with questions about when the baby would arrive and whether it would be a boy or girl. "I vote for a sister," he declared decisively. "Boys are too much trouble." Robert laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "You might be right about that, son." As darkness fell and Thomas reluctantly went inside to prepare for bed, Robert pulled Jane onto his lap in the porch swing, his hand resting protectively over her stomach. "Happy?" he asked, his voice low in her ear. Jane leaned back against his chest, surrounded by the home he had built for them, secure in the love that had grown from the most unexpected of beginnings. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, turning to meet his lips with hers. Above them, the stars emerged one by one in the vast Texas sky, witnesses to a love story that had begun with loss but blossomed into something beautiful and enduring, a story of rebuilding, of second chances, and of the courage to believe in new beginnings. On a bright October morning 5 years later, Jane Reed stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as 3 children played in the yard under the watchful eye of their father. Thomas, now 11 and growing tall, was teaching his 4-year-old brother Samuel how to throw a lasso, while little Margaret, just turned 2, toddled after them on unsteady legs, determined to keep up with her brothers. The ranch had prospered beyond their wildest expectations. What had begun as a handful of recovered cattle had grown into one of the most successful operations in the county, with Robert's innovative breeding programs drawing interest from ranchers throughout the territory. Jane had expanded into raising horses as well, discovering a natural talent for selecting and training superior stock. Their original homestead had been converted into a bunkhouse for the handful of ranch hands they now employed year-round, with the main operations centered around their current home, which Robert had expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. As Jane watched, Robert scooped up little Margaret when she fell, soothing her momentary tears before setting her back on her feet with an encouraging word. His hair had a few strands of silver now at the temples, but otherwise he looked much the same as the day he had first appeared, with tools and determination, offering to rebuild what had been lost. "Mama," Samuel called, spotting her on the porch. "Come see, I almost got it." Jane descended the steps, joining her family in the yard. Robert's arm slipped around her waist as they watched their middle child make another attempt with the small rope, his face scrunched in concentration. "Not bad for a 4-year-old, Robert commented proudly when the loop landed close to its target. "He's got your determination." "And your stubbornness," Jane countered with a smile. Robert chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Fair enough." Later that evening, after the children were finally asleep and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Jane and Robert sat together on the porch swing that had been a fixture of their home since the beginning. The October air held a hint of the coming winter, but Jane was warm in the circle of her husband's arm. "You ever think about it?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "How differently things might have turned out if you hadn't stopped that day?" Robert was quiet for a moment, his fingers idly stroking her arm. "Sometimes," he admitted, I was only planning to stay in Esperanza long enough to earn travel money for California. What made you stop? It was a question she'd asked before over the years, but his answer always seemed to reveal something new. Something in your eyes, he said after a thoughtful pause. Standing there in front of what was left of your home, you looked defeated but not broken. It reminded me of my mother after our fire, except she didn't have anyone to help her rebuild. He tightened his arm around Jane. I couldn't ride away, not when I knew I could make a difference. You did more than make a difference, Jane murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. You changed everything. Robert smiled, the expression still transforming his serious face in a way that made Jane's heart skip, even after all these years. Best detour I ever took. As the stars emerged overhead, and the distant sounds of cattle lowed softly from the pastures, Jane reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment from a devastating fire that had seemed like the end of everything to the full, rich life they had built together. I love you, Robert Reed, she said softly. And I love you, Jane Reed, he replied, his voice carrying all the certainty and commitment that had been there from the moment he had first said, "We rebuild." In the vast expanse of the Texas frontier, where life was often harsh and unforgiving, they had created something rare and precious, a home built on love, resilience, and the courage to begin again. And as the night deepened around their porch swing, Jane knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, rebuilding if necessary, but always moving forward, a family forged in fire but sustained by love.